we have very limited time, and I wanted to make sure we make the most of it. So,
Yes.
as many all of you already know, because I sent out the emails and the messages to the whole group, we have Arundhati with us today. Arundhati Subramaniam is hugely respected, worldwide as a literary figure, and and in terms of her prowess, of course, she's equally competent as a poet as well as a writer. Described as one of the finest poets writing in India today, Arundhati is an award-winning Indian poet. She is the author of 12 books, of which 5 are books of poetry, widely translated and anthologized. Her book, When God is a Traveler, was the season choice of the Poetry Book Society, shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her new book of poems, Love Without a Story, published earlier with what was Westland Amazon, is already in its second reprint. As editor, her most recent book is the acclaimed Penguin anthology of medieval Indian sacred poetry, Eating God. As a prose writer, her books include The Book of Buddha, the best-selling biography of a contemporary mystic, Sadhguru, More Than a Life, and the most recently is Adi Yogi, The Source of Yoga, which is co-authored with Sadhguru. So that's a lot of accomplishments. She is the recipient of various Indian and international awards and fellowships, including the inaugural Kushwant Singh Prize, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Zee Women's Award for Literature, the International Piero Bigonghiari Prize in Italy, the Mystic Kalinga Award, the Charles Wallace Visiting Arts and Homi Bhabha Fellowships, and of course the Sahitya Akademi Award. So very long list. I was telling them that if I were to cut paste and start reading out all of your awards, it would take a long time. But thank you so much for making the time. It's an absolute delight to have you with us. So I wanted to start by asking about the origin of the journey. Poetry, how, everybody in India wants to become an engineer or a doctor. How do you decide to become a poet? I mean, where does that fit into the scheme of things?
I think I could never have dreamt of being an engineer, as this person who helped me set this Zoom meeting up knows only too well. I'm utterly incompetent at anything, I think, other than words, Chetan. It's probably for that reason alone that I turned to it. But less facetiously, I will just say I'm very happy to be here with you again in conversation with you. And I look forward to talking to the other participants as well later on. And I should also mention that it's actually 13 books, because the most
Okay.
recent book is one that's very close to my heart. It's a book called Women Who Wear Only Themselves.
Oh, nice.
And it's about essays and poems. And for those of you who haven't read it, like you, Chetan, I'd be delighted if you picked it up at some point.
I will definitely.
But coming to your question, I think it might interest you. Uh, this whole business of why poetry, it's an interesting question, because when I was starting out as a young writer in the late 80s and early 90s, a question that I was always asked is, you write poetry, how nice. But when are you going to write your first novel?
Ah,
That was always the question, because the assumption was always that poetry was what you did as a nervous young teenager. But later in your life, when you grew more self-assured and became more adult, you graduated to the form that really counted, which was
okay.
prose. And in the 90s, it meant fiction. But, and that's because the Indian novel had, of course, taken off big time internationally. I think if I were to answer it, I would say this. The earliest reason for turning to poetry was just the sheer joy of language in motion, that sense of a language as a kind of dance. It felt like poetry was the only place where language danced, at least me as a child. And later it felt like poetry was the only place where language seemed musical. Again, to me as a young reader and listener of poetry. Later on, I started writing myself, and then it seemed to me like poetry was the only way to talk about any intense moment in my life, any liminal moment in my life. The only way to talk about it was to write a poem, or to try to write what I thought was a poem.
Okay. Wow.
And still later, I think I realized poetry is also a kind of can be a kind of act, a kind of political act. It can be a satyagraha against any kind of ready-made language, whether that language comes from scripture or commercial advertisement or political slogan. Poetry is a way of pushing back against any kind of cliche. It's about looking at any kind of easy formulation in language. And finally, I'd say poetry because of its rhythms, because of its sensuousness, and because of its pauses. Really, it's the only verbal art that consciously embraces pauses. And that makes it, to my mind, irreplaceable.
Wow.
I speak here as a reader as well, not just as a practitioner.
Wow. Awesome. All right. Great. So, so much to take away from the only place where words can dance. That's beautiful. So you've written prose as well as poetry. What do you, I mean, I think the answer has already been given. I was going to ask what is more fun, what is more rewarding. I think you told us already. But what do you enjoy about prose? Why did you also choose to do prose? Why did that kind of turn up on your, list of things? Is there some things, what are the benefits, or what is the reason why you thought that prose was required for something where poetry would not do?
That's a good question. And I'm not even sure I have an answer, Chetan, because the one thing that seemed quite clear to me when I was starting out, and which still is clear to me, is that I won't be doing fiction.
Okay.
This was something that I was quite clear about. But prose appealed. It still appeals. The charms of both, the appeal of both poetry and prose is very different.
Right.
For me, poetry is a kind of poetry is a place where where you use language without joining the dots, whereas prose joins the dots.
Correct.
It
Yeah.
is the power of a kind of reasoned, cogent mind. And there is a beauty in that. I enjoy that. I enjoy the flow, the momentum of prose a great deal. I love the journey from one paragraph to the other. I love the unfolding of prose. And of course, you can texture it. You can texture it so it takes on a particular kind of um, sensuousness that, to my mind, is a sensuousness I associate with poetry. But I think I'm not sure I could ever have written the Book of the Buddha in verse. I'm not ready for that, at any rate. I couldn't have written Women Who Wear Only Themselves entirely in verse. It had to be essays, but I wanted the essays to lead to a point where I could then just drop the reader into that free fall that is a poem. The poem is always an invitation to see language as a springboard, whereas prose is a journey on which you and the reader are, in a sense, dancing together. So it's a different appeal. And I've always thought of prose as a kind of manual labor. You get up in the morning and work at it. Whereas poetry doesn't happen quite so easily. There's a reason why the muses have to be wooed. You can set the conditions and then you have to wait. I don't want to take away the mystery of poetry, because although a lot of it is about craft, there is a certain magic, and it takes a certain humility as well.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Muse. So that reminds me that the Himalayas can be a bit of a muse. And for those who don't know, Arundhati will be at the Himalayan Writing Retreat in April. She taught the first course after a lot of struggle, 3 years of trying, Arundhati, I think it was.
And COVID had something to do with that.
Yeah,
huh?
COVID had something to do with that. But we had the first masterclass in poetry that Arundhati led at the Himalayan Writing Retreat in April of this year. She'll be back in April of next year. So if any of you is interested, you can consider that. This is only physical, it's not online. We do a separate writing course, which is a much shorter writing course on haiku haibun that Rochelle leads. But I don't even know if Arundhati would ever want to teach online. So anyway,
having been to your place, I doubt I'd ever want to do that kind of workshop online. That's a particularly lovely spot. And I'm
Thank you.
looking forward to this, April.
Thank you so much. So my next question was about, where does poetry go? And there's been a lot of emphasis, and a lot of people talk about literary magazines. In fact, on our blog, we have this list of literary magazines where you can submit your poetry. So was that part of your journey when you started out? I mean, you've got anthologies and you're editing them now, putting them together, but was that somewhere in your journey at the beginning?
It was important. It was very important
Okay,
because at the time that I started out, most mainstream publishers weren't publishing poetry at all, or they published, the volume was just few and far between. So it was, in fact, the literary journal that was essential. And I would still say it's very important for a poet because there is a bridge that you sometimes need between the writing of a poem and putting it out into a book. Whereas I find, of course, today that there are many people putting their work out online, and of course, there's immediate feedback for that kind of thing. But there is a particular credibility with a literary magazine that you trust,
right.
and which publishes work that you care for. I think that's the kind of magazine to look at.
Okay. So are there two or three that you would want to mention or share with the group or top of your mind?
Well, there are several. There's Muse India. There's Indian literature. There used to be Poesis when I started out, and there are so many now internationally online, aren't there?
Right.
Too many to name. I think if you just in fact, on the India domain of the Poetry International Web, which is now a defunct website, but the material is up there. If you go to the website section, you'll find a list of publications. That was, of course, the list of publications available in 2012, but there are going to be many more today. And I think
Right.
the people here on at this very meeting probably know very many of those.
Yeah, yeah, most likely. So my last question, and
Hmm.
then we'll open it up for Q&A, was
Hmm.
what would Arundhati write in her letters to a young poet?
To a young poet. Well, the question is whether the young poet is a young Arundhati, because I would say a few things to the young Arundhati that I think she would have benefited from hearing, but we can come to that later, maybe. I'd say to a young poet, to most young poets, this is what I would say. I'd say that you may encounter your share of naysayers along the way, those who tell you, as I heard very many times growing up, that poetry is not the most pragmatic thing to be doing. In my case, I was often asked whether I was writing the novel, as I said earlier. And you'll find those who tell you, of course, that that maybe you're not very good at it. You may hear that too.
Oh,
The thing about poetry is if you feel a strong calling, if you feel deeply excited about the process of writing, and if you feel a certain joy around language, keep at it. I think that's important, to keep at it and keep honing your craft. It's important to keep working on that. And that brings me to point number two, that craft is not a dirty word. Poetry is not just about splattering yourself on the page because you're in a frenzy of inspiration. Poetry is about revising and tweaking and going back to your work again and again, editing, and sometimes savagely editing. It's
right,
all about that too. And that's the joy of making a poem. The joy is not just in that first moment of inspiration, there's also the, the manual labor part, which
sure.
can be deeply pleasurable. And the third thing I would say is read widely, read omnivorously. And if you feel drawn to a particular poet or a particular book by a particular writer whose work you've never encountered before, deepen that engagement. Look at all of his or her work. Follow these passions, because it's really out of that sense of passion that you develop your own sensibility. And there is, unfortunately, um, I think, many people who write poetry don't necessarily read it. And those who say they read it are really largely reading on the net.
Mm,
They aren't reading books of poetry. It's important to read books, and not just anthologies. Zero in on the poets whose work speaks to you and read them deeply, drink them in. It's from that kind of deep marinating that your own voice emerges.
Mm.
So I think that's perhaps what I'd say to young writers.
All right, great. So I'm going to ask you what you would say to the young Arundhati as well, because that would be a big miss if I did not. But while we wait for Arundhati's response, if you folks have questions that you would like to ask of Arundhati, you can put them in the chat, and then we can just I'll just moderate it and I'll take them forward. But yes, Arundhati, tell us what you would say to your younger self.
I think because I was a particular kind of person, and maybe there are some people on this group who would fall into that category. I don't know. I was a particular kind of person who was tortured by self-doubt and given to a lot of self-flagellation. I think I would tell that particular Arundhati and that particular young person to hang in there. I'd say hang in there and trust those mentors in your life, those whom you look up to. There are people whose work you will admire. That will happen inevitably. And it's good to admire work and deepen your appreciation of that work if you're called to a particular person's work. But before you take on a mentor, make sure that you trust those mentors who allow you or who guide you into ways of thinking about poetry without ever being prescriptive. Those who tell you how to think about a poem, not those who tell you what to think about a poem.
Mm.
Yeah, not the content of the belief. Those who tell you these are the possible sightlines, these are the ingredients, these are the resource materials you work with. This is what a poem is made of. And then offer you possible perspectives, but no one who gives you. The important thing is not to pick up an attitude. You have to find your voice.
Right.
And far too often, I think we end up mimicking voices because we believe that's how poems are meant to be written. And that's a tragedy. The important thing to find your voice, though, is one, to have the right kind of mentor figure who encourages you but is not uncritical, and who tells you, as I said earlier, who tells you how to think about a poem, doesn't give you content, but gives you resources to think about poetry. And importantly, not to turn mentors into tormentors. As I often say, that's a tricky one. So you've got to also know how to enjoy someone's work, but still keep the quest going for your own voice.
Right. Okay. Okay. Gorgeous. That was so lovely. I think that's fabulous advice. Thank you so much. First question coming in now. Expecting a lot of questions. Oh boy. Okay, hold on. Yes. So the first question Renu is asking is, can poetry really be taught? Is it an art or a craft?
Oh, it's a good question, Renu. I'm not even sure. My answer to that at workshops always is that I don't think a workshop or a masterclass can make you a poet. To answer your question, I don't think it can. What it can do is to make you, however, a better listener. And if you become a better listener, the chances are you will become a much better poet. So when I say becoming a better listener, I mean that the whole point of sitting around, celebrating poems, savoring them, tasting them on our tongues, is a way of jointly educating ourselves about what makes a good poem. And as we start fine-tuning our ability to listen to what constitutes a good poem, we start turning into much more refined craftspersons ourselves. And when craft is deeply internalized, it's no longer something that sticks out as a look at me, I have the technique kind of quality, which makes, I think, all of us so uncomfortable. Because the whole point of a poem is not to turn it into a self-conscious exercise. If it becomes self-conscious, and we know this even about people, right? There are some beautiful people, but as soon as they become self-conscious, we're uncomfortable around them. The whole point about any kind of art is not for it to become terribly self-conscious and precious. The idea, I think what makes for a wonderful work of art is when it is created consciously, not self-consciously. And that is when ideas of craft are so deeply internalized that we can actually write without knowing which voice it is within us that's speaking. Is it me with my craftsperson's hat? Is it me with my artist's hat? You don't have to play all those schizophrenic roles anymore. It becomes, what I think Wordsworth probably meant when he talked about that spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion. But the point is, to get to spontaneity, you need a hell of a lot of work in order to be able to trust the flow of your voice and the flow of a poem. So hard work and inspiration, or perspiration and inspiration, go hand in hand. They're not separate.
So would it be fair to say that like a workshop or a course or some such thing is more like a, almost like a intensive exposure to an art form? But after that, it comes
Yeah,
the practice. After that comes the diligence and, sitting down every day and crafting, so that you really, otherwise it's like watching a good movie that doesn't teach you how to make one. But to make one
I agree.
is a whole other set of, yeah. But of course, directors watch lots and lots of movies. So, okay.
And I think a workshop goes maybe one step further than just the equivalent of watching a film. The attempt at a workshop or a masterclass is deep immersion, but in the immersion to keep one's critical faculties alive. So you start exploring why a poem works. And once you start doing that, you'll find almost always that quality is alive in you. And when the creative and the critical go hand in hand, and one nourishes the other, you become a better reader and you become a better practitioner.
Hmm. Okay. Shorpani has a message saying, hello, Arundhati and Chetan. I was there at PHWR in April this year. Really enjoyed Arundhati's
Of
program so
course.
much. Thanks, Shorpani. It's great to see you here.
How
A quick,
lovely to see you.
yeah, a quick comment. I know that I owe, 2, 3 of you a response. So I will come back to you on that. So it's still, the door's not shut, just an FYI. Renu's got a comment. She's saying you can't write poetry on demand. So yeah, a lot of writers, prose and fiction writers have this, office hours concept. I also talk about it in the workshop. What do you think
Mhm.
of that? And I think you alluded to that earlier, saying it can't be a on-off kind of a thing with poetry. But would you like to expand a little more?
The good news, Renu, is that there is no demand. That's the wonderful thing. No one's ever asking us to write. No one's demanding poems. So that's the good news. So the advantage of that is that we can take all the time in the world writing our poems, take all the time in the world before putting them out. And I think, the poems and we would be the better for it.
I had a question, and I know it's a very sensitive one, and I don't always like to talk about it. But since we're kind of um, in a comfortable close group here, it's this definition, and we see the same conflict or tension in commercial writing, right? Commercial versus literature. So, what is commercial writing and what is literary writing? And you have so many, without naming names, but Instagram poets who've now published books and sold 1 million copies coming out of
Mhm.
Canada and whatever you have you. So what is commercial poetry? I mean, I don't know if commercial poetry even existed till 10 years ago. But now suddenly you have
Mhm.
the Chetan Bhagat equivalence of poetry, and then you have literature. So
Mhm.
how does that whole thing work, and how do you see that conflict? Is it even a conflict, really, or does it not matter?
No, I don't. I think really more power to all those who want to write and write the way they choose. And I'm absolutely, I think I'm actually very uncomfortable with living in a state of contempt about anything really,
Okay.
including poetry that's what we call Instagram poetry. I'm not contemptuous of it, but I will say this, that if you want to deepen your engagement with poetry, what are you drawn to as a reader? That will tell you something. And do you want to deepen that? Do you want to become uh, a more nourished reader? If you do, you will start looking for something. You will start looking for something more, and that will lead you somewhere. It will happen on its own. If you're I'm not, I'm almost scared to use words because everything is so value loaded. But, there is a joy in eating bhel puri, and there is a great joy in sitting down and eating, something that's been cooked, the dum pukht, for many hours on end.
Right.
And they have their own place. But it's really up to you what kind of reader you want to be and what kind of poet you want to be. When I first read T.S. Eliot at the age of 12, 13, or however old I was, I really didn't understand what was going on, Chetan. I didn't know who T.S. Eliot was, and I didn't know what was going on in that poem. All I knew is I wanted to be there. I really wanted to be there. And I didn't want to be anywhere else. Now, that led me to a particular kind of quest as a reader and later as a writer. The fact that I wanted to be around these poems, not simply decode them, as we were later encouraged to do as students of literature, but I wanted to just be awash in this kind of poetry. And later, of course, my tastes grew more specific, and I went to particular poets who made me feel that way. But I think that's really it, isn't it? What satisfies you? And are you inclined to deepen your appreciation?
Talking to you is like poetry. It's like when you pick a word like awash, it is so
Mm.
wonderful. Or like you said, dancing with the words. So it's just listening to you speak. It's like, yeah, it's fabulous. Okay, lots of questions more. Um,
Mm.
Sangeeta has a question. I wonder if you're familiar with the works of the Irish poet David Whyte. If yes, I would
Mm.
like to ask what you think of his work. I'm a big fan and look forward to exploring your work too. Thank you. It's great to have you with us. Thank you, Sangeeta.
Thank you, Sangeeta. No, I don't know David Whyte, but I will look out for that. I don't know David Whyte's work, I'm afraid.
All right. So next question. Hi, Arundhati ma'am. I'm an ardent admirer of your work. While reading a poem, what are the various aspects to pay attention to? Also, while writing a poem, sometimes it feels forced if I try to push to finish it. Can I ask how to get around this?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew. Who's that question from?
Some poor the name is getting truncated. Sampurna, I would
Okay.
imagine.
Sampurna, maybe? If it is Sampurna, let me just say, Sampurna, I wish I knew, because I'm just grappling with some poems myself and I really don't know where they want to go. So I can't even give you a response without implicating my own sense of frustration sometimes around this utterly mystifying art that we seem to all be so collectively fascinated by. Let me say, there are many things you look for in a poem. I look for metaphor because I found myself, and many of the participants who attended the masterclass I did earlier this year will know that I talk at length about it when we're reading poetry, because I find metaphor as really a wonderful way of getting to deeper places that I can't always get to uh, through statement alone. And so I'd say metaphor because it's a beautiful bridge between the concrete and the abstract. And of course, I would say listen to the poem, listen to the sound of the poem, because we've really forgotten how to talk about the sensuous resources of poetry. What does it sound like? What does it taste like? What is the smell it gives you? There are particular books that that really create a fragrance in your room, in your heart. That's the kind of work you want to just be, going back to the word that Chetan liked, you want to be awash in. So I'd say look for the sound qualities of a poem, the rhythms of a poem. Listen to the tone of a poem. Is it murmuring to you? Is it banging a hammer on a table and telling you what it thinks? And if so, why? Why is a poem choosing to talk this particular way? Why isn't it talking differently? Would it have been less effective if it was talking differently? If if a poet chose to raise her voice, would she sound different? If she chooses to whisper, does she sound different? Why would she exercise such a choice? These are all questions to just think about. And so I think these are some of the things to look for. There are more, but for that we probably need to do a longer session together.
Yeah. Right. Jessica has a question. She says, when you write poetry, this is about your personal way of doing things. Do you focus on getting intentionally rhyming, or do you write it as it comes in free verse? So I've read your poetry, but yeah, please.
Yeah. So Jessica, it's not like free verse comes readily either. I always say that both free verse and meter involve a great deal of work. So it's not like a poem finds itself on the page effortlessly in free verse. No, because form, the way in which you work on a poetic form is just as rigorous, whether you're using free verse or meter. Both have their own strenuousness. I think we often forget that, and we assume that free verse is what comes easy and meter is what needs to be worked at. Both need to be worked at.
Oh, yeah.
And personally, I'd say I write a lot more free verse than I do meter, but I enjoy, because I enjoy sound and I enjoy rhythm, there are times when I allow what we call assonance to enter, half rhymes, and sometimes enjoy the whole process of rhyming too. It depends on the intent of the poem. So I have a kind of anthem poem, as I call it, in my most recent book, Love Without a Story. It's called A Song for Catabolic Women. And that rhymes from beginning to end. But that's not how I would perhaps usually write a poem. It really depends on the demands of the poem itself.
Yeah, I remember you recited that when you were at the retreat. I would love to have you recite that for us. But we'll see once we get through the questions if we have the time. I remember it was about
And
4
I don't have
minutes.
my book here, I'm afraid,
Oh, okay.
Chetan. So it
All right.
can't
No sweat.
happen.
That's fine. The
Yeah.
next question was from Ram. So I'm going to skip some of the questions which are coming from same people. If you have time, we'll go back to them. Okay. Ram has a question saying, how important is structure to a poem?
Ram, I think it's hugely important. The structure may not be immediately apparent to a reader. It may seem like, going back to the earlier question, like free verse has not thought about its structure very much. But in fact, as I said earlier, free verse thinks deeply about structure too. Any poem really has thought deeply about why it is the shape that it is, why it is the size that it is, why it is the sound that it is. All of this is hugely important. And this is true of any kind of poem. That's a great deal of thought has gone into it. Even if a poem was written in this great burst of inspiration and it ended up being a perfect four-line poem or five-line poem, the decision to keep it that way is a conscious one. The decision to let it be exactly that way is a conscious one. So I'd say structure is hugely important.
Himani has another question. How was your experience with the literary magazines when you had queried for the first time? And since then, would you know how much has changed?
When I had queries, do you mean?
When you had
What would
queried,
that
when you
mean?
had first written to a literary magazine or a literary
Ah,
journal?
oh, I see. Yeah, what was my experience? Well, I mean, I remember the joy of acceptance, when your work is accepted. I remember the high of that and actually seeing it in print. I don't know if people have quite the same high nowadays because, really, I didn't even know what it was like to see my poem on a typewritten page. We'd be writing poems. And finally, when you typed it out, it already looked different. And then when it appeared in a magazine, it, took on another sense of gravitas. And so, hmm, I think I'm grateful for those literary magazines that did take my work because it helped me hugely in in building confidence, and also in knowing really why I was writing the way I was. It helped to strengthen my understanding of certain choices that I was making as a writer. And I still remember the ultimate high. Who is this question from? Say her name again.
Uh, this was Ram's question, no? You were answering.
Oh, it was
No,
Ram again?
Himani,
No, it was
Himani
someone
Nayar.
else.
Sorry, my fault.
Himani. So
Himani.
Himani, I
Yes.
remember how, the absolute high was when that first book happened. But it was a big high because I had waited a decade and a half, before that book happened. So I think time worked somewhat differently in those days. I can't even think of what it's like today as a young poet when you write a poem, believe it's taken on the shape and form that you want it to, and where you can put it on instantly online and get your responses by the night. I can't even think of what that's like. It was very different for me.
Instant gratification is a terrible thing, I think. I think it gets
I
in
think
the
there are
way of,
dangers.
yes. I definitely
There are dangers.
agree with that. Yeah, we have more questions here. It was really wonderful. Ram is saying, I'm wondering if some of us FDC participants in Mumbai can meet Arundhati for a chat over coffee. Just listening to her is like Zen meditation, he says. So,
Ram, I'd be glad
Sampurna has another
to do
question. I
that.
absolutely love metaphor and images slash sonics in a poem, and they make the poem come alive for me. Thank you so much. That's more of an observation. There was a question earlier from Jessica. She's saying from
Mm-hmm.
Williams Wordsworth's focus on trees, leaves, rivers to today's Rupi Kaur self-affirmations by way of poetry. Michael Fortet's overly sexual poetry masked as romanticism to Lang Liav's musings taken as, I don't even know how to pronounce this word. How has the quality of poetry fallen or risen? Looking for your opinion as to what constitutes good poetry.
Oh, Jessica, we'll have to have a much longer conversation for that. In fact, I'd be actually a little wary about making any pronouncements myself because I don't think I can certainly say there are more publishers for poetry, for instance. This is a fact, this is true. But I cannot really say the quality of poetry has risen dramatically. I'm wary of making a generalization like that, particularly when it comes to world poetry. We're talking about far too diverse a scene. I can't be. It would be wrong of me to speak of, uh, you know, uh, one context, one cultural and linguistic context, and leap to the other and say it's all different. But I will say, as far as Indian poetry is concerned, Indian poetry, Anglophone poetry, there is undeniably more ferment than before, and that's because there are more avenues than ever before. So that's a good thing. The part that I think is always challenging for every writer, however, whoever this is how do you find a voice that you can call your own? I think this is the challenge, where you acknowledge a voice that acknowledges cultural literary context from which you arose, and which also represents the kind of poet you want to be. How That's the journey, isn't it, of a tree? You're never separate from the humus from which you arose. In fact, that nourishes you deeply. You decide uh, what influences you want to incorporate into the making of you, which is why Borges has that wonderful line, every writer creates his own precursors. So you're creating your precursors along the way. Who are your ancestors? Who do you want your ancestors to be? And that's why I say gravitate towards those poets whose language, whose poetry speaks to you. By doing that and by immersing yourself in their work, you will begin to discover your ancestors. They could be from anywhere in the world, but you will discover that ancestry. And through that, you begin to find your voice.
Wow. That's yes, let me move to the next question. Thank you so much for that. Shorbani has a question saying, how do you approach the work of editing poems?
Sharbani, come back for another workshop. Didn't we
She
discuss this
wants
at the
to.
master class? I think we
She
I
did.
want you to say it again. I will come back though.
Oh, Sharbani, how does one edit? I think it's as I told you, I think my strategy is to write as much as I want, and then to put it away and come back to it ages and ages later when I've kind of almost forgotten about it. That could be a month later. It could be a lifetime later, which is what it seems to be right now. I've just emerged from a retreat and I don't even know what poems I was working on before the retreat began. So that's almost like looking at the work afresh. When you look at it afresh, you suddenly know this part is inauthentic. This part I was posturing. The poem doesn't need. And a lot of stuff begins to drop off, begins to seem superfluous. And you can actually allow it to drop without too much pain to your poetic soul, so to speak. And when that happens, you know that the poem doesn't need it. There's so much superfluity, really, in a lot of what we say. And therefore in what we write as well. The important thing, though, Sharbani, is to make sure that you don't butcher the heart of your poem. So even while you're editing and being ruthless about the editing, don't ever amputate the heart of the poem, because then you've lost it.
Cool. Thank you. That's beautiful. Ram has a question saying, can you suggest a reading list for poetry? What we can do is maybe you can share a reading list, some recommendations with me. We have a WhatsApp group for this group, so I can share it there after this session is done, if that's convenient for you.
Actually, Chetan, I sent you a bunch of books, didn't I? I mean, I sent you a list of books.
Yes, after the masterclass.
Recently for a bookshop.
Yeah.
So I
For
think,
the Kunzum folks,
the
yes.
start is actually to pick some of those, that entire lot. And I mentioned anthologies there only not because I'm advocating the anthologies alone, but because it's an invitation. An anthology is an invitation to zero in on the poets whose work speaks to you.
Right.
There are some poets I've discovered just like that. So there's a bunch of books I've actually sent to Chetan. It's quite a long list, about 8 or 9 books.
Yes. So I can share that with everyone, of course. That was for Kunzum, which is a bookstore that we kind of do some stuff with. There's an interesting question here, which also relates to my favorite poet. Jessica's question might be the last one. She says a lot of songs sound like poetry and a lot of poetry sounds like songs. As a writer, how do you walk the thin line in favor of sounding like poetry? And the favorite poet I'm talking about is Leonard Cohen, who is better known for his musical rendition, but of course he's at heart a poet. That's where he came from, and he's published many books of poetry. So what is your kind of opinion on that?
How does one walk the fine line? Is that her question?
In favor of sounding like poetry, as opposed to say songwriter. So as a writer, how do you walk this thin line in favor of sounding like poetry? I would imagine, as opposed to songwriting, which is.
So I agree, and I love Leonard Cohen too, and I think we talked about that, Chetan. Yes. So I'm with you on that. But I will say, Jessica, if it's about really what you're called to do, which is where I suspect this is coming from, look at what a lyric is. What is a lyric? A lyric, usually the definition of a lyric would be a poem that is essentially simple in terms of one dominant mood or tone. And that often it creates a kind of, to use an Urdu word, a kind of mahal. That's what lyric is doing. Often by using a refrain, sometimes by just distilling a single mood, and so that's a particular kind of poem. If you want to write that, there's room for that, and it's absolutely fine. It's not an inferior or superior form. It's an approach to one kind of utterance. Then there is another kind of utterance which may want to do other things. So you've got to write the poem that needs to be written, and then think of how you want to use it. So for instance, in the act of saying something aloud, I may find the need for reiteration. And when I reiterate something, it may have a particular impact. When I see it on the page, I may not need to underline it quite so many times. I may need just to leave a little space around it so that it takes on a certain um, visual emphasis. Or I may choose to repeat it once, maybe not more than that. So there are lots of choices we make depending on the domain for which we are writing. But I'd say, since if you do both, write the way you want, and then see where you think it's best suited.
Great, thank you. We are just running out of time. Shorbani had very, generously offered to read out "Catabolic Woman," but I don't think she has it open on that page. She was telling me, but I think we are just running out of time. So, we will wrap up the Arundhati session here. You can stick on for another 5-10 minutes, and we can talk about how things are going as far as the writing. Arundhati, I mentioned that this is the first draft club. So all of these are folks, many of them are poets actually, who are trying to
Yep.
write a fast draft, or some of them have set themselves poetry goals of writing X number of poems in the month. So the word count doesn't count. But before you leave, I did want to inform everyone of one thing. I got a very nice congratulatory email from the Chirag School. We've raised 1.25 lakh rupees for the school, given that it's 60 participant. So Chirag is this lovely, very small school. I'll take you there when you come back in April, Arundhati. It's the school where my kids went when we moved to the mountains. So it was a small
remember
Hindi
you-
medium NGO run school. Yes, beautiful, beautiful school. It follows the Krishnamurti philosophy. And so the whole FDC is about raising money for that school, amongst other things, of course, getting people's writing going. But on the other side, we benefit the school a lot. And so in this FDC alone, we've raised a little over 1.25 lakh rupees.
That's
So
fabulous.
that's huge. And I just wanted to thank everybody. And I wanted to tell you also that we hardly make profits. So we are not required to do any CSR, but call it what you will. But yes, it feels great. And I wanted everyone to know.
I'm so
So
glad, and congratulations to all of you. I think I saw a message from Jessica saying, "Yay, us," which I think is a fine sentiment, and I echo it. And on that note, I want to thank you, Chetan. Thanks for this conversation.
thank you
And
so
to all of you, all the best with your first drafts and your last ones, and keep the journey going. And I look forward to staying in touch in one way or the other. Yeah, stay well, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Arundhati. It was so wonderful
Thanks.
having you. All right. So now we come back to the it's so inspiring to speak to her. No? It's like so magical to have a chat with her. It's awesome. Just the way she picks words, even on the fly when she's having a conversation, is like it's instructive. So yes, wonderful, wonderful lady. So how's it going on the writing? Anybody want to share anything? People want to talk about how it's been going. Then we can pull up the word count. I don't want to focus too much on the word count. I looked at it. We're about 130,000 words. So very nice. Some people seem to be really moving forward on a good clip, and it seems to be helping them. But anyone want to share any comments? Otherwise, I had an idea for what we should start from tomorrow, if Ram is willing to help me.
I just wanted to ask one thing. I am between actually two books, as in I've already done with my book one. It's a series of 3 books. So basically, when I joined this, you all guys, my purpose was to get on with the book 2. But now every second day I keep going back to my book 1 only to rewrite it somewhere, because then is it natural? Is it all right? Like while I'm writing book 2, I keep going back to the book 1 to make those corrections and all, but it kind of is hindering the process of working on the next one. So so I am finding myself in a bit of a fry over here for that. That's why you'll see my count like 0 on most days.
I mean, it's the important thing is that you're focusing and you're getting work done, right? Now, whether that work is going back and improving something, I mean, clearly your first book is getting better because of all of this work, right? You've got new ideas, you've got new edits going, and you're sitting at a desk and you're saying, I have to write. Now you sit down to write book 2, but you still end up working on book 1. and you're improving in editing book one in that process, I mean, sure,
Yeah.
why not? You know,
I know,
so
but
it's
I'm
not, we're not prescriptive saying no, but you have to write this one only. It's not like that. It's about, are you engaging with the craft? Are you writing more? Are you are you engaged with your writing? And as long as that's going on, what you choose to write is entirely your discretion. That word count is
where
really.
does the story but stop, where does the story stop evolving, as in like I have to let go of it, like, because I've already worked so much on it. So that's what I was wondering, how do I move from that to next one, or can I keep on
This
going
is why I
forward?
tell everybody who comes to my workshops that deadlines are a wonderful thing, because once you have a deadline, everything changes. If you don't have a deadline, you can edit, a piece of work for
Yeah,
10
yeah.
years and it still won't be done.
Yeah, actually,
So
that's where I'm standing right now.
yeah, but at some point in time, you have to tell yourself, okay, I think I'm done. If you're able to get a deadline, sometimes you submit something to a literary agent or a publisher, and they tell you, okay, or you make a personal commitment saying, on this date, maybe your birthday, maybe on the 1st of January, whatever day you pick whatever's a day for you. But give yourself a deadline and say, I have to be done by so and so day. It may work, it may not work. Douglas Adams, on the other hand, said, you know, I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make when they go by. Okay. So,
Yeah, I
so you
suppose
have
that
that,
would be
you
me.
have that also. So again,
Yeah, yeah.
you're doing work. You're doing work. It doesn't matter whether it's the first draft or it's editing an earlier draft, but
Yeah.
you're doing work, and that's, I think, the most important thing. Yeah. All right. So, Ram, are you there? Yes, of course. So, what I was thinking we should do, and for those of you who don't know, Ram is kind of has been the closest the FDC has ever had to a CFO. Okay, he's a CA by profession, and he's a bean counter. So he would, after the first FDC, he would go out and do this analysis and tell us, this is what happened in week 2, and this is when the word count fell, and it was like a full numbers data analysis analytics company coming and doing a number on FDC for us. So, and he's very good at it. So, but the other thing that Ram had suggested, which had taken on a life of its own, was the idea of introducing word prompts, writing prompts, right? So, Ram, what I was thinking we could do is maybe kick off a writing prompts from tomorrow.
Yeah.
A lot of people get very anxious when they see the writing prompt, because it's like, if you're a diligent student, if you had straight A's, then it's like an assignment and you feel ki are writing prompt aaya abhi kaam karna hai, right? But it doesn't have to be like that. So it's a little hard for some people to get it, but a writing prompt is an option that's being made available to you if you feel like you're stuck. For some people, it really gets the writing flowing again. It's like a trigger. Okay, it's like a small incentive. You can, or a small catalyst. You can choose to use it. You can choose to ignore it. Don't feel guilty about not having written to the prompt. Also, don't share something from a 5-day-old prompt in the group. Every day you'll get a prompt starting tomorrow. Okay. The reason we are not doing it from the first day is because, again, from Ram's analysis, we knew that for the first 7-8 days there is good momentum, and people are able to write in any case. They have the energy, there is enthusiasm, so people write. But slowly around the 7th or 8th day, right, Ram? It was.
Yeah. After 1 week, from the 8th day, it starts flagging.
So from the 8th day, it starts flagging. So we're at day 11 now. So from what I will do is tomorrow morning, it should be before 8 a.m. I will put a writing prompt. Okay. And I will nominate the next person to put a writing prompt. And Ram, I'll nominate you. And there is a few general guidelines on how to put prompts. Ram, once he's done, will nominate someone else from within this cohort. Okay. Just keep an eye open for when you are being nominated. It's random. It's not a solid process. Everybody won't get their turn. If you feel really strongly, you can go to the guy who's putting a prompt next day, that day, who's been nominated for tomorrow, and tell them, can you please nominate me? Some people really have a great idea for a prompt, then by all means do that. But otherwise, it's a kind of random process. You just have to nominate somebody. My only request is, if you are being nominated, just make sure you put a prompt in by 8 a.m. the next morning, so that people have it. Some people are early risers, and it helps them in their process of writing. That's all. That's what I would like to share. I will also explain all of this in a detailed WhatsApp message before 8 a.m. tomorrow morning, along with the writing prompt when I share it. Okay. Cool. So yeah, some people are saying they haven't updated their word count. If you have been writing, then please do update your word count. It helps for other people, and we'll take a very quick look at it before we go. But it helps other people as well. Here we are. I'm sharing my WhatsApp. Sorry, this is all the notes that I made from. I should stop sharing and make sure I have the right page. Give me a minute. Yep, here we are. All right, 1 minute. All right. So we can see some people have been quite diligently updating the word counts here. Chitra has been at it. That's good work, Chitra. 1,000 words every day, pretty much. Himani also, you're showing a lot of count, Himani. So I don't know why you're concerned. So yeah, lots of people have been writing a lot. Some people have not been writing too much, but they've been honest in putting zeros. Others have not put anything at all. But it's nice to see that, you know, when you look at the overall group in 11 days as a community, we have written, what does it look like? As a community, we've written 121,000 words. That's roughly the equivalent of 2 novels, right? So it's always nice to see this. So if you just update your word count, whatever it is, like Sangeeta, I know you published that beautiful blog post. That is word count. It doesn't matter that it's going into that book or it's some other project, but wherever you have something going on, go in there and add that to your word count. I can see Vivek is right now updating it. So yeah, so whatever be your count, do share that on here, and it'll just help the whole community feel like, okay, you know, you see 5 people are writing a lot, then you also feel like maybe I should also write, and try and go back here, and if not every day, then at least every other day, you know, update the count. It makes a difference. Yeah. Cool. So we'll call it a day, 6 o'clock. It's been an awesome evening session. For those of you who may not know, next week we have Nikhil Gulati. Nikhil Gulati is the author of The People of the Indus. He's an incredible guy. He used to live about 3 kilometers from my house, and young chap, maybe like mid-30s or even younger. And you know, he said that I'm writing this comic book, and you know, he said that every time I met him, and he was a neighbor for 3-4 years, and I was like, okay, hoga, likh raha hoga. And then when we were building the Himalayan Writing Retreat, physically building the Himalayan Writing Retreat, he actually came and did manual labor with us. For 3-4 days, he did manual labor at 600 rupees a day, dihadi, plus lunch. Okay. This is a guy who's writing a comic book. His book just came out. And when I would ask him, okay, what have you done? He said, I have an engineering degree, I'm an MBA. And, you know, he was very casual and flippant about the whole thing. He said, I don't really like this whole corporate thing. So I've decided I want to be a writer. So his book came out just now. A Penguin has published his book, The People of the Indus. It's a hardcover comic book. I have like 5 copies of it in the house because I'm gifting it to everybody I know. And when I read the introduction, I realized that he's actually got his MBA from IIM Ahmedabad. Okay. So, but he did that, and he was like, you know, that wasn't my thing. And now this is what his thing is, and this is what he's doing in life. So we have this man on the FDC next Sunday. So yeah, let everyone know. I think it will be very interesting. He's the most unassuming person I know, but he's really into the craft. He also attended one of our workshops in 2017. Maybe I'll share that video as well. But yeah, so it'll be interesting talking to him. Cool. So yeah, let's call it a day, and I shall see you next Sunday at 5 o'clock. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.